Thanks so much for coming out tonight and for braving the cold and being here with us. It's great to see so many faces and people who are interested in Jim Roddey's legacy and the history that he left for all of us. It's been an interesting week, right, at the federal level. It's a good time to have this conversation, and so we're eager to dig into it in a few minutes. But before we get started, I want to introduce Chancellor Mark Nordenberg. If you've been active in Pittsburgh over the past couple of decades, longer, you know that Chancellor Nordenberg was a dynamic leader of the University of Pittsburgh and someone who understood that the university's walls and responsibilities don't end at the campus but extend into the full community. And I was a reporter at the time when I first got to know the Chancellor. I was a reporter at the Tribune-Review, and you see people from a distance. Sometimes people are afraid to get too close to you when you're a reporter. Maybe that's not surprising. And I saw the Chancellor from a distance. But over the last few weeks as we planned this event, I've gotten to see him a little bit more intimately, and it's really been instructive. It's been nice to see and understand, and I've learned a lot just by watching him in this short amount of time, just how gracious he is and how open he is to not just feedback, but he's been welcoming to everyone around him. And so please join me in welcoming Chancellor Mark Nordenberg.
Thank you, Andy. That was very, very kind. And as we were talking about our past interactions a little while ago, I said, well, if there were any bad ones, I blanked them out of my mind. So it's great to be here. It's great to be at Point Park. I mean, you look out here and it's just spectacular, isn't it? And think about what this university has done to transform this part of the downtown area. It really is a gift to all of us. And so Andy, as the ranking member of the Point Park community here tonight, I do say thank you, and I think I can say thank you from all of us. And it's great to be here in an evening that has been inspired by Jim Roddey, who was a very, very good friend and a mentor and helped me in a broad range of ways along the way, including serving as the chair of the search committee that ultimately led to my appointment as chancellor. So you can factor that into everything I have to say. But let me talk a little bit about Jim, beginning with years that were long before he came here to Pittsburgh, providing an incredibly reliable indicator of all of the many good things that would follow. Even as a young man, Jim was a person of incredibly high accomplishment. He was a state high school champion in track. He won a full scholarship to TCU. He served in the Marine Corps for 9 years, rising to the rank of captain. And he was a very successful business person in the South, among other things, serving as president of the Turner Communications Corporation, a name that most of us know. Then on December 28, 1978, this region received the proverbial gift that kept on giving when Jim and Ellen Roddey moved to Pittsburgh. They came north so that Jim could pursue business opportunities. And as we all would expect, he was successful in those ventures. But it really is his broader contributions that have shaped the legacy of Jim Roddey. He helped to transform and elevate this region when it desperately needed that help. And in everything that he did, Jim stood as an inspiring example of how people should respect, treat, and care for each other, which may have been an even more important contribution to the region. At a time when Pittsburgh was not well known for quickly welcoming outsiders into its fold, this region quickly embraced Jim. His many obvious personal qualities leading to the rapid recognition within the community that it had been joined by a truly capable leader and a genuinely good person. First impressions do matter, and Jim always led with a heavy, appealing dose of gentlemanly charm. His sense of humor quickly led him to become the MC of choice for all kinds of events supporting all kinds of organizations, which gave him broad exposure within the region. And his wide-ranging interests were matched by an expansive array of talents and a business-like commitment to getting things done. Most important, Jim was willing to do almost anything that he believed would help advance the greater good. When this county made an historic change in its form of government, despite a significant disadvantage in terms of voter registration numbers for his party, Jim was elected the first Allegheny County executive. One local newspaper took Allegheny County executive and converted the acronym into ACE and just referred to Jim as ACE in the columns that it wrote. A title that also was fitting for Jim in other ways. When we celebrated his life at an event at Pitt last spring, all three of his successors, each of them from the opposing political party, came to praise the contributions that he had made in blazing the trails that the first county executive would need to do. Of course, Jim's impact extended beyond what he did as an elected official. Here is a partial list of the boards he chaired: RiverQuest, the Port Authority of Allegheny County, the United Way of Southwestern Pennsylvania, WQED, the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority, Alcosan, the Pittsburgh Public Theater, the Three Rivers Arts Festival, and the Three Rivers Regatta. Now, he chaired all of those boards. He also served on the boards of some of the region's most important institutions and organizations, including Pitt, UPMC, the Allegheny Conference, and the Carnegie Museum of Art. And I know from firsthand observations that even if he was not the chair, he was a leader on each of those boards. As I noted a moment ago, his genuinely respectful style was a hallmark of Jim Roddey's leadership. Fred Tiemann and Laura Ellsworth, and at least Laura is here today. I don't see tall Fred is in the background. Fred Tiemann and Laura Ellsworth, in nominating Jim for an important award at Pitt, commented on this quality, saying this: "In recent years, the fabric of our society, from our democratic principles to the civility of our discourse, has been torn apart by increasing acrimony, hyperbole, dissension, and even violence. In the midst of this chaos, Jim Roddey is a voice of reason and compassion. He is loved by Republicans and Democrats alike because Jim is interested in people, good policy, and public service. Just a little over 6 years ago, Jim wrote a letter of thanks to Pittsburgh for what he considered the 40 great years this region had given to him and Ellen since they had come north. As those who knew, watched, and worked with Jim all knew, it really was the Pittsburgh region that should have been sending a letter of thanks to Jim. He was a caring and very capable contributor. He was a voice of reason and compassion, and he was loved, as was just said, by Democrats and Republicans alike because his overriding interests were in helping other people, in developing and implementing sound policies, and in contributing in any other way that he could to the betterment of the community. He would have deeply appreciated the fact that this program was being launched in his name. And I really do want to thank Andy and Brandon and Joe for taking the lead in bringing us all together this evening and getting this off the ground. So thanks for being here. I look forward to sharing a wonderful evening with you and hopefully building some of the traits that distinguish Jim and that make this region an even more special place. Thanks.
Mark, thank you for that great introduction, for setting the context for tonight. Thank you also for blacking out any of the difficult questions I might have asked over the years as a reporter. And like Mark said, there are a number of notable people here in the audience tonight. I do want to take a moment to thank Governor Tom Corbett for coming and joining us tonight. Thank you, Governor, for being here. We've also talked about journalism and how when you're a journalist, you sometimes say things and people pay attention to them, and you have to really own up to whatever you've written or put in the newspaper. And that's the case tonight with Brandon McGinley. Brandon is a writer at the Post-Gazette, editorial writer, and he threw this idea out there after the memorial for Jim Roddey, saying there were all these incredible people in the audience and we should get together more often. And there were people across the political spectrum, and wouldn't it be cool if we did something that the Jim Roddey circuit, and we did it on an annual basis. We got people together who have differing opinions and perspectives, and we had a civil conversation. And because he put that in the paper, I saw it and I was like, I texted him immediately and said, Brandon, we should do this. And he was like, what? I don't know. Really? No. No. He was on board from the beginning. He really bought into the idea. And then, of course, when we were putting this all together, we couldn't do it without Joe Mistick. Joe is, of course, Jim's counterpart on TV. He was his, the yin to the yang. And those of you who know Joe, he's just an all-around terrific guy. So please join me in welcoming both of these guys to the stage, and then. Thanks, guys, for being here. Brandon, what were you thinking? Why did you, what inspired you to write the column and then to follow up? And then what were you thinking when I reached out to you?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so, Jim's memorial service, which, I know Joe had a lot to do with, and Mark, was an event where, in a time of political acrimony locally and nationally, it was great to see so many people together in an environment that was where there was a sense of consensus around Jim and his life, but also a sense that what we shared, what the people in that room shared, was more important that made them different, at least in that moment. And without minimizing the differences, I understand politics is a high-stakes game. It's important to have those moments in person together, because the theme for me in that column, and a big theme for me tonight, is going to be trust. And trust can really only be built on an interpersonal level, in person, face to face, and it's often destroyed by the way we talk about and to one another over the internet and in other contexts. So, opportunities to get people with different perspectives, from different walks of life, from different institutions, with different, with their own values, in a place where they can build that trust, is for me just incredibly important for the region and for our political culture.
I will say the thing that resonated for me when I read the column was that, and what I remember from working with Jim Roddey and seeing the two of you do your TV show, Joe, was that there are things that we can all agree upon, even if we disagree on some of the policies or principles or how we get there. But it feels like those things are shrinking, that there are fewer moments that we can all sit together and say, we agree on this, or we, this is a point of commonality. Joe, I wonder if you could talk for a moment about Jim's legacy. Mark obviously set things up, but...
Yeah, Jim was one of those extraordinary people who did all of this naturally, what Brandon was talking about. It didn't start out that way, at least from my point of view. I had a different view of Jim, having been Sophie Masloff's chief of staff while he was chief executive of Allegheny County. WQED-TV came to me and said, we want to do a point-counterpoint kind of show. We want to have some political debate, lively political debate. It's not turned on. Okay. I hope I'm projecting. I'm a traveler. Okay, thank you. So WQED said they wanted to have this political debate show, and I agreed to be the Democrat, and I was hoping they'd get me a can of corn, as we used to say when I boxed. A can of corn as the Republican, somebody I could easily beat. And then when they came back all excited to say, we got Jim Roddey, he agreed to do this, I got a little concerned at the outset, because I knew he was a formidable opponent. And in the first few shows, I was into it. I gave the producers what they wanted. I was aggressive and a tad irascible. And Jim just sat there calmly and would nod and smile. And after about the fourth or fifth show, I looked like a lunatic. and Jim began, he was making sense. So I realized that I had to get more in line with his approach than my approach, and I did that. And, he had this great sense of fairness, which he invested in everything he endeavored to do. He said to me one time he wanted to take our show on the road, so we took it to St. Barnabas, well, obviously his first pick, right? So we took to St. Barnabas and had a nice crowd, and we were up on the stage. And at one point, the nice people of St. Barnabas started to boo me loudly. And I couldn't figure that out. I was a little taken aback. And it was only later that, Jim would look at me and shrug his shoulders. It was only later that he allowed that perhaps they had booed me on his signal. But he said, no, you pick the next place. So I picked a theater in Regent Square, the center of progressivism in the city, where he got booed, and he called it even. So we had great times together. We had honest discussions, and we also agreed on far more than anyone would have guessed than we would have guessed. And I think that's still true. That's still the case. We seem polarized, but we agree on more things than we can imagine.
Why is it that it doesn't feel that way, though, right? That in these days, it's more about how hard you can go at the other person rather than can we get together and have a conversation? Can we have a cup of coffee?
The opposing voices are loud these days. And you can be shouted down. Your opinion can be shouted out. It's the nature of social media, and I think that's fed our presence in the rest of the media and in our regular daily lives. It's a shame, but what you're hearing you're not hearing the majority view. You're hearing the two fringes of both parties at opposite ends screaming at each other. And most of us are still somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and I would say also that those that the range of views that is expressed and expressible has widened as well. And so when you simultaneously you have the kind of the window of possibility has widened, simultaneous with the fact that those who are most aggressive in expressing their point of view, most, and you used a word that I think is really important about Jim, fairness. Those who are most unfair actually generate the most enthusiasm because they make the people on their side feel enthusiastic, exuberant, exhilarated. And so I think I do think that there is genuinely, I think polarization is a real concept. I do think that it is driven by social media. I think people do agree on less than they used to. But at the same time, in low-stakes environments, in environments where a big decision isn't being made, in environments ideally among friends and family, I do think that there's a possibility to work from a foundation of trust or to generate trust that wasn't previously there, and not come to an agreement necessarily, not come away being like, oh, actually we agree with about a lot more than we realized, but understand one another better, come away saying, okay, I still disagree. I still think maybe even that person's views are dangerous if they were to be implemented. However, I understand how they came to those views, and we can now argue fairly.
I think there's one other element that Jim used generously that's missing today, and that's a sense of humor. We cannot laugh at ourselves anymore, and we certainly can't find humor in our plight, even if it's something that will benefit us at the time. He kept his sense of humor, and it served him well, but it also served the rest of us well. And he could disagree with, that old saying, disagree without being disagreeable. In the first 90 days, I guess, of the first Trump administration, we did one of our road shows. And it was at Carnegie Mellon, and we had a nice auditorium, pretty much full of people, to do sort of a, what's happened so far kind of presentation. And Jim had been suffering from a back injury. And he said, I don't know if I can make it, but I'm gonna get a wheelchair, and we'll get a car to take me there, and I'm gonna do this because we were at the last minute. And so, I figured I got to win this debate, right? How am I going to lose this debate? And Jim came in the car, and they helped him into the wheel and pushed him out on the scene. We walked on after the show had been introduced, much like this event. And I went out first and sat down, and then Jim came out, pushed in a wheelchair. And he started, and I'm supposed to win this, right? I have every advantage at this point. And he started off by saying, I'll bet you're all wondering why I'm in this wheelchair. And he said, well, I have to defend Donald Trump, and I need all the sympathy I can get. So I lost at the outset, But that sense of humor, that serves us well. We have to laugh at ourselves. We have to find humor in these things. Not everything's a death match, and you don't have to die on every hill.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about where we live, right, is that every 4 years we get this, opportunity to hear this conversation. We're on the front lines of the presidential election battle, and everyone in the audience has someone in their near life, their community, their family who doesn't agree with them politically, but we all have to figure out a way to get along and to survive. I wonder if you guys could talk, maybe Brandon, if you could start by talking about what that experience was like for you as a writer of opinions to, live through the past year with so much hyperbole and so much animosity on the two sides. How did you deal with it, and what is your takeaway for what that means for the region that we live in?
We made a commitment at the editorial page at the Post-Gazette, a written commitment on the 1st of January, 2024, that we would not shirk our responsibility to comment on the issues of the day, but do so in a measured tone and to, as far as possible, seek to lower the temperature rather than to raise it with the choices of vocabulary, with the choices of substance that we made. And I think that's an act of choice that we have to make. And that rests in tension with the fact that the stakes of politics have risen. Like, it is different now than it was 10 years ago, than it was 20 years ago. The stakes of politics are always very high. And to the extent it ever seemed that they weren't, that was a mirage. And that mirage has faded, and we realize that politics really is a matter of life and death. But you can only do politics well if you can debate, discuss, argue in a measured way, because that's the only way in a democracy to come to, even if not consensus, come to understanding.
Except you can get more clicks and more attention, as you pointed out, the more
Exactly.
hyperbolic you
Exactly.
are. Yeah.
But here's the thing. A century-old newspaper of record is never going to be the loudest voice in the room. We cannot compete with Twitter. We cannot compete with the podcasters. We cannot compete with YouTube. We can be distinctive, and distinctive is the name of the game in any venture, by being measured. And we're not going to win against, like I said, everything I described. But we can try to be the best among the alternatives to that, and hopefully help people to see what they've missed by glomming on to the dominant mode of communication.
Well, I do not have the broad responsibility that Brandon has. Brandon's responsible for a whole section for the portrait of the entire community. I write a single column for the Tribune-Review. My columns are distinctively not balanced. They are my opinion, but others at the Trib have to worry about providing that balance as well. And there are other people, other columnists who write opinions that are at the opposite end of what I write. But he has the tougher job, and he's right about that. You only gain trust if you're presenting both sides of the argument, and you're presenting the best arguments on both sides. And if you can engender that trust, then people will hopefully weigh both sides against the middle and find their path, a fair path and a good path for our community and for the country.
I had a professor in college who's famously conservative, but his class was one of the most popular on campus. It was also famously difficult. The grading was very difficult. And the reason that the grading was difficult, but also the reason the class was so popular, was that if you made the best argument possible for your point of view in a paper, but did not raise an attempt to refute alternatives or arguments against your position, you'd be lucky if you got out of there with a B- or a C+. What was valuable in grading and what was valuable to this professor and was valuable then to students, and is a lesson that I try to apply as best as I can. It's hard in 850 words in a column to raise and refute everything, but you have to understand the arguments against your position and attempt as far as possible within the context that you have to help your reader understand the alternatives to your position, and then that makes your position all the stronger. But again, fair to say that is not the mode of discourse that is in vogue, but I think it's an intellectual discipline that is essential to doing politics well, and it's an intellectual discipline that a newspaper can help to promote in a way that a Twitter personality can't.
the audience here is very impressive tonight, and we will. I'm going to turn the conversation over to you in a few moments because I want to hear your perspective on this and your questions for these guys as well. So prepare for that. But as I'm listening to you, I want to believe that there is room for this reason, that the good guys, the good girls can still win out. But when we look at the national conversation that we're having, it seems to be the loudest voices. It's the most hyperbolic voices, the ones that are the extremists. As you said, the people who say the most ridiculous things get the most clicks, and not only clicks translate to money, right? They're making money off of it, and people are saying more and more outrageous things all the time in an effort to gain more attention for themselves. And I think about it from the perspective of journalism too, where it used to be journalism, the role of the journalist was to hold power to account, to represent the people who didn't have a voice, and to ask questions of those in power on behalf of the taxpayers and on behalf of the citizens. And now it seems like for many journalists, the role is instead how close they can get to power and how they can cozy up to it and not ask difficult questions, but instead be the best friend of whoever's in power.
Yeah. Well, they're not journalists.
Okay.
Right? But I think we have to rely on the good thing about the extremism that we're experiencing now is that eventually it brings us back to center. And we have to rely on the extremists to bring us back to center. And we'll find our way back. We always do. But, they'll have their day, and perhaps they're having their day. But eventually, we'll get back. You have to govern from somewhere near the center, left of center, right of center, but somewhere in that general area. Former County Executive Rich Fitzgerald is here. He'll tell you about that, right, Rich? Governor Corbett's here. He did the same thing. He relied upon Democratic votes to get his transportation bill passed, which is the crown jewel of his administration. There'll be people working for the next 15, 20 years as a result of that transportation bill. And that was Democrats and Republicans joining together somewhere near the center to pass legislation that was good for society, was good for the Commonwealth. So the extremists, though, they do us a service. They drive us there eventually. Eventually, they overplay their hand. And if they overplay it long enough, we'll find some place where we can agree.
I think that kind of governance or finding that center is easier the closer you get to home, where governance is more about the competency of getting things done, of getting the trash picked up, that kind of thing. Even at the state level, I think that it is possible to succeed in that way. I am less confident at the national level. I think that the national, international social media and overall environment is not conducive to it. It is far more conducive to performativity, and I think that, frankly, a critical mass of people are somewhere between disillusioned and fed up with not just the national, but the international kind of, not to be too grand about it, but the order of things. People feel dissatisfied by it in a profound way. And so it's one of the reasons that my focus, as you said, Joe, very kindly, my remit is quite broad. And so I write about national stuff. I enjoy doing that. But in some ways, it's more enjoyable and more impactful, and allows us to focus on the more brass tacks things, to talk about the local, because that's where you will find more of that, people coming together and finding agreement. I know for a fact there are so many people in the city who I've been blessed to get to know, about whom I've found remarkable commonalities at the city, county, even state level. Once you get beyond that and you get to the more abstract and the ideological and the philosophical, it starts to diverge. But that's, for me, that's that's the good of focusing on the local.
We're going to get to test your theory here over the next few months, right? We've got the mayor's race.
Yeah.
After we've just gone through, this whole process over the last year, and it's starting up all over again. It's hard to believe that it is, but what are we going to see with the mayor's race, and is it going to be as divisive as maybe it's setting up to be?
Well, I think we'll be divisive in terms of the philosophical direction that the candidates want to take the city. Aristotle said that towns should be built so as to protect their inhabitants and at the same time make them happy. That sounds a pretty simple statement, right? Hard to get to, obviously, but I think he was talking about the basics of life. People don't want a whole lot from their government officials. If you're the mayor of a city and you can plow the streets and pick up the garbage and fix the potholes, you'll probably be elected forever. When you miss one of those, snow removal, I mean, let's talk about that, right? When you miss one of those, you begin to have problems. That's how that's how the mayor of Chicago, the incumbent powerful machine mayor of Chicago, lost 35 years ago. Had a couple bad snowstorms and didn't plow the streets, couldn't clear the streets. So it's the basics that make people happy. Now, if you do those things and you do them well, the voters will let you do a few other things. Some things that you might have wanted to do for a long time. But you have to earn the right, and you have to earn the right by running things. First and foremost, you have to run things. And if you can run things well, then you can do a lot of other things. I think that that's going to be an issue in this upcoming mayor's race. I don't think things are being run well. And when you look at the history of progressive mayors, Jim and I both had problems with the extreme ends of our parties. But when you look at the history of progressive mayors and progressive district attorneys, they're not doing well. Voters are beginning to push back. Because while they have great big ideas, they're leading with those. And they're trying to do those things before they plow the streets, fix the potholes, and pick up the garbage. So you have to run things first, and I think that will be an issue.
I agree. I don't think it has to be a divisive race. I think that for the exact reason you described, the focus I don't think you have to go too far from the brass tacks to have a compelling race and compelling rhetoric about the basics of running a city. If it does become divisive, when it does become divisive, it will be because of the choices made by the candidates and their surrogates, if they believe that it will be effective to gin up emotions, the passions, to make people upset. And so I hope we will go a long ways. We talk about snow. Let's talk about briefly. Let's talk about probably the biggest thing. And here I will credit the mayor for bringing the questions of zoning and land use to the table. We have major issues with these in the city that need to be addressed, and we are addressing them. If we address them person to person at the level of policy, we can come to, I think, some really, really good improvements that are genuinely progressive and genuinely pragmatic. If, on the other hand, questions of land use and zoning become turned into issues of ideological purity or deployed not to achieve, if not consensus, at the very least, like I said, mutual understanding, and becomes questions of, like I said, purity, or whether you are against so-and-so, or identity politics and all this, then it will become divisive in a way that it doesn't have to be. These are complicated and, for me, fascinating questions that affect everybody. They shouldn't be subsumed into unnecessarily divisive rhetoric.
But they might be.
Oh, they will be.
Okay, they will be, all right.
Yeah, they will be. Yeah.
They definitely
Yeah.
will be, all right, okay, great.
No question.
Yeah, well, thanks for giving us some positive hope. Now, I know a lot of you have dinner reservations after this, so we'll move this thing along, but let's take some questions from the audience. Let's hear perspective of those of you in the seats. We've got a runner, and if you could raise your hand higher so she can see you, and she'll bring the mic over. Yeah, there you go.
Thanks very much for this evening. It's wonderful. Had a lot of great things to say. My name is Ray Werner, and I'm one of Jim Roddey's 40,000 best friends. You know, I just want to say a couple things about him. And he had the ability to change people's lives, one person at a time. He looked at people one person at a time. I'm going to tell you a story of how he helped me. Okay, we met each other in 1984 when the United Way campaign. Dan Rooney was the director, and Jim was on the committee, and I was a creative guy, and he liked my work. 2 years later, I started my own decided to start my own ad agency. Bought a firehouse in a strip. My wife and I sunk everything we had into it. I had no clients, but I had a couple prospects, and I'm a pretty up person, you know, and but I was having a down day, and we stopped for a drink where ad guys like to go. It wasn't Froggy's, but it was near Froggy's. And Jim Roddey happened to come in. And I knew him. He knew what I was doing. And I told him, he said, "Ray, how you doing? How's your new business going?" I said, "Well, it's just getting off the ground," but I started unloading on him a little bit. And he took me aside, and he started talking to me, you know, and he was telling me why I was going to make it. One point after another. With a big smile. He made me laugh. I'll tell you what, I went home and I told Susan, you know, that I just bumped into Jim, and here's the reasons why we're going to be okay. You know, we had 3 kids going to private schools, et cetera, you know. So we had a good run. And one of our clients that we picked up was University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, UPMC. We got them off the ground with the campaign that the theme line was, "Choose a hospital as if your life depended on it." Jim was on the board. He called me and said, "Ray, it should be UPMC. Keep it simple." Those simple words on the billboard. I said, "You have a point, let me think about it." So we started putting that on the ad, showed it to our client, Jeffrey Romoff. He got credit for changing it, but it was Jim Roddey. It was Jim Roddey's suggestion. And he's the one that deserves the credit. So I want to thank Jim for all he did for me, and thank you for the opportunity to say that. Thank you very much.
Nice, yeah, thank you for sharing this story. I mean, it really underscores how politics is done well, too, right? It's, like you said, it's for everyone, but it's one person at a time as well. So thanks for sharing that. We have another question up here, one in the back.
Hi. I'd like to ask this question first of Joe. Yeah, like that? First to Joe and then to Andrew. Joe, you talked about this debate you had with Jim after 90 days of the Trump administration. So I'm
Right.
curious what you think about, what would you tell your students? What would Jim Roddey say? What would your readers say if you had to explain the first 3 days of the second Trump administration?
Wow. Well, that brings to mind precisely why I miss Jim so much. I would have been on the phone with him at least once a day for the past 3 days. You know, we were both alarmed at the direction that each of our parties was taking with the extremes of the Republicans and the Democrats. And the last thing we talked about before he died, we were on the phone just a couple of days, and before he passed, he said to me, "You know, it's getting harder and harder for me to be a Republican." Now, he wasn't going to leave the Republican Party by any means, but what he meant was that there was less room for moderation in his party. And I said that it was getting harder and harder for me to be a Democrat for the very same reason. And so we parted on that thought, and he would have been dismayed. He would have been dismayed because there are a lot of people in the middle, Democrats and Republicans, and poor people and people with special needs that society has an obligation to meet, who are going to be hurt, and that would have troubled him. He was a kind and generous person.
And I would say from my perspective as a journalist, it's a question of objectivity. I've been thinking lately, even before the inauguration this week, about my first job. I worked for Jack Anderson, who was the self-styled Mormon muckraker, and he was in Washington, and his whole thing was to dig up dirt and figure out what the truth was. And Jack's, his personal feelings, I don't know what they were. He never let on. I'm sure that he probably leaned more conservative. And today he would have been labeled by others as conservative or libertarian. But Jack didn't do his journalism by his personal feelings. He did it based on what was best for the people. I mean, it was underscored, everything was what was true about what would best serve the taxpayers and the citizens. And I think Jack ended up on President Nixon's enemies list because he raised questions about and pointed out that the Nixon administration was doing one thing, but behind the closed doors was doing another thing. And it was that hypocrisy and that the other wasting of government dollars were the things that motivated him and drove him. And I'm concerned that we don't see that kind of reporting or attention today, just asking questions of people in power on behalf of the people themselves. A government of the people should be accountable to the people. And we don't see that from our journalists and our reporters. That said, before we came up here this evening, we were talking in the green room, and Kalian, who you met earlier, was there, and she made a very vociferous defense of objectivity and explained how even though she has particular feelings herself and her classmates have particular feelings, that to be effective as a journalist, she needed to set those aside, leave them at the door, and go in and just be an objective reporter. And it gives me hope that some of our young people are taking away that message from this moment, and hopefully they carry it forward. You had a question?
Yes,
Yeah.
I don't have a question, just a comment.
Hang on.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just a comment.
You have to-
Many years ago, I heard Jim speak, and you or someone mentioned, Missy, I'm sure who, that he belonged to many organizations throughout the city. And somebody asked him how he did that, and he said he agreed to be a part of that organization if he could be president or director. Because, I mean, I'm sure he was sort of joking to some extent.
Not too much.
Oh, really? Because he said, I set the agenda, I set the meetings and where they are, and I have control. It was one of the greatest pieces of, I know he maybe was kidding and to some extent, but it was a wonderful piece of advice to me.
Yes. Other thoughts from the audience? About a big round of applause for the Playhouse staff. They've done a tremendous job of supporting us tonight.
I hope that was for me. I'd be interested on the comments from the panelists on the premise that the lack of education in civics and history is causing the political discord that we have today.
What do you think, Brandon?
Okay.
No?
Yeah, I'll start.
Yeah.
Yes and no. Yes, in that there's no question that a lack of grounding in an understanding of the American project in particular, that where it's situated in history and where we are situated within American history, has left people to become adrift and not understand or have an appreciation for or feel connected to the deep roots of American civilization and that we should feel we have within that civilization. And that makes it a lot easier to want to attach oneself to points of view that are either outside that tradition or that challenge that tradition or that or that are in tension with that tradition, or that would even want to radically alter it. I would say no, in as much as learning these things is not a panacea against pursuing alternative or extreme views, because there are many people who are steeped in history, who become steeped in history, who, precisely because of the broader context that the country finds itself in, it's precisely learning history, and it's precisely being steeped in that makes them want to consider alternatives, that makes them look at our moment in history and say, this is actually a moment of radical change that I want to participate in. So we absolutely have a crisis of civics and of historical literacy. But I think that that's a contributing factor, but I do not think it's a panacea. I think that ultimately you still need people to trust the institutions that are running the country, and that we associate with its well-being, and you need to trust that what you're being taught is real and valuable, and you need to trust the teachers. And if you don't have that trust, then no amount of teaching is going to attach you to those roots.
I think that the failure to teach civics has a secondary effect that's really what's harmful to all of us. Civics can be taught in an alluring fashion. It can be an incentive, a temptation for young people to join in the governmental process, to join in what's going on in their communities and their community organizations and political parties. It's the first they learn about all that. And if they're not learning about that, they may not even know what opportunities exist. And as a result, they have no appreciation for what goes on the ground. In this last election, I placed a number of my election law students at various places throughout the system on election day. They were presidents, or they were judges of election at local boards. They worked with the election judge in common police court. They worked with general counsel to the Republican Party and to the Democratic Party on election day, and they all came back amazed at how well the system works, at how problems would arise and they could be addressed on the spot, and how we get fair elections. And the more familiar you become with it, the more you will realize that we have a system that works. But if you're not teaching civics, I'm not sure what the hook is to pull young people into this aspect of our community life.
And I've been sitting here listening to you, and there's the story we tell about our country, about the civics of our country, but there's also the reality of what our country has gone through, and the moments that have led up to this. I think of the work that John Meacham has done to highlight the difficult history of our country. And sometimes we act like that's ancient history, and really it's not. It's part of our recent history, and it's part of our present. And I wonder if we've lost sight of that the narrative of our better nature is being lost because the worser side of our nature is coming forward.
Well, I would say a few things. I think that well-intentioned revisionist histories of the United States that are intended to disillusion people with what is genuinely, in many cases, a kind of legendary or mythical understanding, are, while they may be valuable in some respects because they do pierce a myth, we shouldn't be surprised if that disillusionment ends up going both ways. And I do think that we sometimes forget how dangerous it is to play with founding myths. Not saying that we leave them unexamined. Not saying we say everything that the Founding Fathers did was brilliant. That has its own dangers. Of course it does. Yeah. But disillusionment, it can cut both ways. It can cut in a variety of ways. And once we start to tinker with these things, this is something I do think is genuinely unusual about the moment we're living through, that not only are the variety of political options widened, the variety of historical narratives in which we place ourselves is much wider. And that makes it difficult to even have a common ground from which to argue or discuss the present moment if we have radically different understandings of what led to the present moment.
Yeah, that's true. I've been thinking too that it's no wonder that Pennsylvania is at the heart of this debate. You know, that this is where the Whiskey Rebellion took place, right? I mean, this, you know, and that spirit that we celebrate at times, the spirit of the Whiskey Rebellion, is still alive here today, right? It's that suspicion of government and that idea that we know best at the local level. Yeah.
The American story is a wonderful story, even with the blemishes and the beauty marks. And you need to hear the whole thing to be romanced by it. You know, the greatest part of the story is when we learn about what we've had to overcome. So if we're not teaching civics, if we're not teaching the ups and downs and the struggle and the pitfalls and the times we managed to make it to the mountaintop, it's no wonder that people are turning their back on government. It's no wonder that they're not getting involved in politics, and it's no wonder that they don't appreciate how good this system is, how well it served us with all of the problems we've had, especially you know, the ones that are currently in front of us. There's not a better place. But if you're not teaching our government and our politics to our young citizens, that story will never come through. And that's the tragedy.
Yeah. Let's take another question from the audience, yeah?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Warner Macklin III. I think I know a lot of you in here, so hello, everybody. A lot of mentors in here, and my former law professor.
Hey, Warner, how are you,
How
buddy?
you doing, Joe?
Good.
Professor Mistick. Two different thoughts here. The first one's a personal thought about Jim. And if somebody said I'm probably one of Jim's 40,000 friends as well. But more particularly, I met my wife through Jim. So every time he would see me, he would always say, "How's she doing? Did she kick you out yet? Did you have your kid yet?" So he was a great person in that aspect. So without him, I wouldn't have met my wife. But now more to this discussion at hand about the loud voices winning in today's political environment. And I agree with everything that was mostly said this evening, especially the last discussion. But I think it's even more than that. People are not trusting government because they don't think government is helping them. They don't see any tangible change in their day-to-day lives. So they can care less who a governor is, who a president is, you know, who a mayor is, because they're struggling to buy bread. They're literally struggling to buy eggs, and they're seeing the world rapidly change, and they're not a part of that change on the positive side. They see a bunch of folks becoming richer, and we're celebrating them every few moments. There's literally 3 billionaires minted in the United States every 6 months. I mean, that's crazy. Now there's a term called lesser billionaires. It's not just a billionaire. You're either a real billionaire or a lesser billionaire, somebody with less than 2.5 billion. You know, and so the average person will never become that. So, you know, they just crowd out all the politics, and whoever says whatever buzzword is at the moment that they feel that they connect to, they'll reject reality. They'll reject everything else. They just want to grab onto something to help them feel that there's some change and that they can be a part of, or at least if not them, their kids would experience. So until we get a handle on that, we're going to just keep having these esoteric conversations over and over again, and it's just going to keep getting worse and worse. Thank you, and Happy New Year.
Yeah.
Well, I think that on the point of visible, tangible change, this is where I think somewhere where you and I will differ, Joe. I think that I actually don't think that the early radicalism of the Trump administration necessarily portends badly for it, politically speaking. Because one of the big problems that people, even those who are not ideologically completely aligned with the Trump administration, have had is that the administration changes, Congress changes. What about the country changes? What about the world? What about my life? Does anybody actually run this thing? And so, and do our votes actually matter? I think it's possible, this is a counterfactual given how things have already started, I think it's possible that if the Trump administration were too timid, it would be punished politically, because it would be another example of, wow, it looks like something radical has changed in our government leadership, but nothing has actually changed in terms of the way the government's run. What's the point of this whole operation? And so I do think that the political dynamic has changed at the national level. I do think there's much more room for the center at the local, perhaps even the state level. At the national level, I actually think that radical change sells. Not just promising it, actually doing it.
I read Brandon's most recent column, in which he predicted, or more or less concluded, that what we're witnessing now is the end of the beginning, and now we're looking at the beginning of a new approach. And we do differ on that. I believe that the pendulum will swing. I remember many times in which the death of the Democratic Party was announced, or the death of the Republican Party was announced. And as I said earlier, extremism eventually brings both parties towards the center. And I think we will go through that. When we're at these extreme times, though, the astonishing thing is that so many people vote against their own interest. And that's surprising. But I think after a while, maybe they realize they voted against their own interest, and they begin to soften and move closer towards the middle. For this week, I've written about the pardons of those who viciously beat police officers on January 6th. Now, I just said in the column that I have many friends who are police officers, and many of them will be mad at me for taking this position, even though it's their colleagues that were beaten in Washington, D.C., because they voted against their interest. They voted for a lot of other reasons, perhaps, and they should be shocked by these pardons, but they won't be. And I think it takes a while for that to wear off. And I think we're hopefully approaching the moment when it will wear off.
The one thing that comes to my mind from this question is whether, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately, especially as I have had the opportunity to travel the country, just is the United States too big? You know, as we're getting more fractured ideologically, and we see things like the fires in California, the snow in New Orleans, and stories all across the country. And Joe, you talk about the American experience, but is the country too big? Have we gone too far?
You mentioned Aristotle earlier. Aristotle would be appalled. I mean,
Well, if it is too big, we don't need Canada.
Or Greenland, or Panama.
a republic on this scale has never been tried.
Yeah.
And the ancients who coined the phrase res publica would not have thought that such a thing was possible. It's America's bigness is one of the things that I love about it. It makes it beautiful. I haven't seen as much of the country as I'd like. We're planning a family trip to the Badlands this summer, and I can't wait to see parts of the country that I've only ever seen on a screen. I don't want to lose any of it, and I don't think that's going to happen. However, 300 million people is a lot of people to hold together in a Republican form of government. And 250 years is a long time to hold people together in a Republican form of government. Our run has been pretty damn good. And we had a pretty bad fracture, we put it back together.
Right.
Arguably, the thing was refounded in '65, but yes, I think that I think we have. You said what, the end of the beginning or beginning of the end of the beginning. I think that there were many moments you could say that Francis Fukuyama's end of history ended. You could say 9/11. You could say Brexit. But I think the final blow was November 5th of last year. I do think that we have entered a new phase when things that we thought were settled are no longer settled. I don't think in the next 4 years you're going to see a state attempt secession or anything like that, but I think you're going to hear people talking about it, and not just in the way that people talk about things, not just in the way, I mean, the eastern counties of Oregon are talking about joining Idaho. They've been doing that forever. Washington could do the same. That's all very difficult constitutionally. It's idle. But I think you're going to start seeing people. This stuff percolates. It begins in the bowels of and not extreme, but kind of esoteric think tanks and things that seem like they're extreme, but that people are going to start developing legal arguments for secession again. There's going to be nullification. These are things that are going to come back. So I do want to insist that lots of the things that we think are settled, borders between the states, the borders of the United States of America, the consensus on liberal values, broadly speaking. I do think that within a decade or two, those things will be contested again. And some of them are absolutely being contested right now. I mean, just look at the Greenland conversation.
Right.
That's a legitimate conversation. It's not absurd. And the more we think it's absurd, the more likely it is to happen, because we're blind to the fact that the world has changed. Yeah. And, you know, a melting massive island full of minerals is not just going to sit there. Something's going to happen to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Greenland's been on the table before.
Yeah.
But I probably wouldn't invade Canada. The last couple times we tried that, they beat us, okay? So I'd stay out of Canada, Greenland's still on the table, yeah.
You guys said so many brilliant things, and all I could think was, I hope Brandon is doing a video blog of his trip to the Badlands, because with the children in tow, it's going to be amazing. Yeah. Let's take one more comment or question from the audience, and then we'll think about wrapping things up.
So thank you for this conversation. It's been just absolutely brilliant. And you guys talk like you write, which is incredibly beautiful and intimidating, so I just wanted to lay that out. We've talked a lot about Jim as the politician and the political voice. But when I sat in the back of the room of that celebration of life that Mark and Joe organized, and I looked at all of these incredibly diverse people, each of whom loved this singular man. They loved him. They weren't just there for fame. They were there because they loved him. And I sat there and I thought about why that was. And I really think it was two things, some of which were reflected today, but one wasn't, and I think is worth talking about. One is that he really loved people, as was said, but he manifested that in 1,000 quiet moments. Warner talked about one, you talked about one. We all have a quiet moment when Jim took us aside and took the time to care about us as human beings, sometimes in our most difficult moments. So that's number one. Number two was that he threw himself into so many different civic activities, civil society activities, not politics, but civil society activities where he actually delivered on a scale, and always in a leadership position, right? Really good things for people, whether it was little kids, whether it was education, whether it was sewers, whatever it was. He actually delivered results that mattered. And even if he just went and emceed your event and had a great event, right? People loved him for that. And so I think it is individual initiative to be kind in the quiet moments on a huge scale like he was. And number two, for private citizens to invest themselves far more actively than they do now in the civil activities that we need more than ever because our political system is so fractured. And I wonder if you could comment on, A, do you think that's right about Jim? And if so, what is the role of the press and academia and business leaders and all of us to foster those two priceless attributes that I think were such an important lesson that Jim taught all of us?
Why don't you go, Joe? You know him best.
I would sometimes think there had to be 4 or 5 Jim Roddys. He just did too much, and he did everything well. And I'm not sure how he was able to do it all. His kindness, as you had commented, was he would lead with kindness and lead with compassion. And even in those private moments, he was just one human being talking to another human being. And now I know a couple people there have said they were one of his 400 or 500 friends. Well, he told me I was his best friend. But he probably said that 100, 200 times to different people. And it was always true, because I probably was his best friend, and they were too. That was the nature of the man. He had more than one best friend, and for good reason. He was always there for you, and he was always there for the community. If you've ever seen him run a meeting, you would know why he insisted on being the chair of these organizations, because he ran a meeting more efficiently than anyone you'd ever seen. They'd get their work done, and then they'd move on to the next event. So at his memorial service, the Chancellor Nordenberg really was the master who put that together so well. At his memorial event, there were silos of friends from different aspects of his life. And he paid attention to each one of those silos of friends. I mean, he was an integral part of all of them. And I got to meet some wonderful people from walks of life that I never imagined I'd encounter. But they were all his friends and his best friends at his memorial service. He led with kindness.
Brandon, when you wrote your column, you insisted that this was not going to be a one-off type thing, but something we would do over and over again. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, yeah. I think that trust and understanding, mutual understanding, these aren't things that happen one time. They're habits. And habits require regularity. They require doing a thing again and again until the habit is formed. And so, so many of the things, I mean, we talk about politics, a lot of the problems when we talk about listening to the loudest people in the room and not listening to the most reasonable person in the room, that's a habit that we arguably used to have, or at least to some degree, that habits have been broken, or new habits have formed. And breaking a habit's easy, forming a new one is hard. And so, yes, I think, doing things, getting people together regularly and practicing being people doing the small p of politics, just the person, getting to know people and in building that trust and that mutual understanding. And I think that when it comes to civil society, as Laura said, I think that's really important as well, because those institutions, those organizations that occur outside of kind of big P politics, outside of elected politics, outside of the state, the government, that's where so many of the results that really matter for people happen. And that's where people also feel deeply connected to their communities. When you describe Jim's ability to get things done, what you're describing is his commitment to excellence, personal excellence, and an excellence that, by virtue of being excellent, kind of pours itself out for others. How can the press participate in that or help to nurture that? I think that, well, I don't think that, I know that we live in a time of cynicism and irony. I think that to the extent that the press can combat that cynicism and be frankly earnest, sincere, about the good that can be done in civil society instead of treating everything like it's doomed or a joke or corrupt to the core. Doesn't mean turning a blind eye to things that are actually bad, but those areas that where everyday people can get involved, I think being less cynical, being less ironic, being more earnest.
I'd like to end with what I think Jim would say about this great divide and our loss of our sense of community and the distrust that exists out there. I think he would say with kindness and with hard work, we will get it back.
Well, and I would say that you're all now part of this journey with us. Thank you for being present tonight. We don't have the answers for what this is going to look like going forward, so if you have ideas for what this should be going forward, please reach out to one of the three of us and let us know what you think that could be. When we were planning for this a few weeks ago, I took these two guys to lunch, and they started riffing, and we really could have stayed there all day. And you can understand why I was so excited to get them on the stage, because they did a great job tonight. And thank you to Chancellor Nordenberg for setting the stage for us, and to Kalian for her welcome at the very beginning, and to all the folks here at the Pittsburgh Playhouse. Thank you so much for tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. Great job.